Okay.
Alrighty. Okay, thank you everybody for joining us for Science on Tap today. We're joined by Sunil from the Astronomy and Astrophysics department at UC Santa Cruz, and he's going to be telling us about his awesome research mapping fast radio bursts and learning about matter in our universe. I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Nick. So first of all, I'd like to thank all the organizers, especially Nick, for getting in touch with me and telling me about this opportunity. And I'm really excited to be here tonight. And also thank you to everyone who's tuned in to listen to me talk about my science. So this work that I have going to present today is what I've done for my first year project in collaboration with people all across the globe. And it is titled Mapping the Missing Matter in Our Universe. So yeah, I'm Sunil Simha from the Astronomy department, graduate students. Let's get into it. Oh. My slide's not working. Okay, there it is. All right, so this work that I will be discussing has been condensed into this paper that we recently submitted to the Astrophysical Journal, and it's titled Disentangling the Cosmic Web Towards FRB 190608. This work has been, of course, done in collaboration with all of these people mentioned here, who are part of the After the Fort team, which stands for Fast and Fortunate for FRB follow-up, and also the CRAFT team, which is the Commensal Real-Time ASCAP Fast Transient team. So this is mostly based in Australia. All the observational facilities for CRAFT are in Australia, but there are a bunch of astronomers who are also doing follow-up studies with other instruments distributed across the world. These four gentlemen here primarily are the major contributors to the paper that I led. So they're Joe Burchett, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Astronomy department, Xavier Prochaska, who's my advisor, is a faculty at the Astronomy department and at UCSC, both of them. Oscar Elek is a postdoctoral researcher in the computational media department, and Jay Chittidi, he was an RE student at the Mariah Mitchell Observatory, and he will be starting his graduate studies this fall at CU Boulder. So I'm thankful to all of these people for continually working and supporting the study, and for all of everyone else who have been a very important part of my life. This is Science on Tap after all, and there needs to be an appropriately themed drink of the night. And this one comes from my friend Jay Chittidi, and it's called the Fast Radio Burst. And he recommends you take one shot of vodka and chase it down with Cosmic Cranberry kombucha. If you are someone who prefers a mellower drink, then he recommends you mix 1 part of vodka to 5 parts of kombucha and some lime juice. I know this is a troubling time. Many of you are mostly, well, probably all of you are at home and you might not have these things, but if you have some time and you're able to get your hands on these ingredients, do give this a try at some point. Okay, so this talk is primarily about which is the study of large-scale structure in the universe. And as any, and if you've been to any cosmology presentation before, it's very likely that you have noticed that the slides begin with a description of the Big Bang Theory, and that's what I'm going to do. So you know the song, the whole universe was in a hot, dense state, yada, yada, yada. Basically, the universe started expanding and it started to cool in the process. So we have all of this wonderful structure that got formed by the end of it, all the stars, the galaxies, the Milky Way, our Milky Way, are all a result of the billions of years of evolution that followed the Big Bang. So starting from here from Earth, if you look further away, you're looking further back in time. This is because of the property of the universe, that is, light has a finite speed. So it's like getting mail back 100 years ago. If someone sent you a mail from Europe, you had to wait for a few months or a month or so before you got to read it. And that's what light is doing. Light is basically our messenger for the information from the other parts of the universe, and it kind of takes time to travel such distances. So if you look far enough, towards the very end, you will see something called the cosmic microwave background. Now, as the name suggests, this background radiation comes from all parts of the sky. So basically, wherever you would look, you would be able to see this radiation. This radiation has a specific property that it is very close to what is called a black body temperature, a black body radiation spectrum. Basically, if you've ever looked at any hot object, a hot piece of metal or iron, you know that it glows, right? And if you were to take a spectrograph, an instrument that records the spectrum, and if you were to look at these hot objects, then you would get a very characteristic shape. And this cosmic microwave background has the very same shape, and therefore it's a thermal radiation. So you can assign a temperature to the cosmic microwave background, and it turns out it is 2.7 Kelvin. So it is very, very cold, and this is not at all what you would expect from a snapshot of the early universe, which is what it is, because you thought, the universe was so hot back then. But this is a property of general relativity. Basically, as light travels towards us, it gets redder and redder, and this light has traveled so much that it went all the way from ultraviolet to microwave. So by studying the fluctuations, so on this map over here, which has been produced by the Planck collaboration, you see all of these interesting structures, basically fluctuations. Oh, sorry. And each of these bumps, like the red and the blue variations here, are minute fluctuations in the temperature of the background. So I told you that it is basically 2.7 Kelvin throughout, but these minor fluctuations are of the order of like 10 parts in a million of this 2.7 Kelvin. So you see, what you're seeing here are very tiny fluctuations, and by studying the spatial distribution or the statistical properties of these fluctuations, scientists are able to determine how much of each ingredient the universe is made of today. So as of now, we see that the universe has 68% of the universe is made of dark energy. We have no idea what this is. Basically, it's some sort of a force that is responsible for the expansion of the universe. So it exerts the pressure that pushes everything in the universe away from each other. 27% of the universe is made of dark matter. Again, we have no idea what this is, but we measure its effects. Basically, we know that dark matter, if it exists as particles, would behave the same way regular matter would under the influence of gravity. So what this means is if you have two clumps of dark matter and you brought them together nearby, then they would attract each other because of gravity, and they would behave the same way as a bunch of stars or any normal matter. Remember 5% of the universe is what we see, basically, and it's mostly called baryonic matter. But whatever you feel, you smell, whatever you experience with your senses and also through your instruments, it's all baryonic matter. And it's such a small part of the universe. What I'm not including in this pie chart is radiation and really fast particles called neutrinos, but they're so small that you can basically neglect them for the rest of this talk. So we know that 5% of the universe is made of normal matter. What does this matter look like? So if you were to run a simulation with only dark matter, that is only particles of matter, and you turn on gravity in your simulation, you would get this wonderful structure after a billion or billions of years of evolution. You can run it in a span of a few hours to a few days on a supercomputer, of course, and you get to see this wonderful structure called the cosmic web. So you see a bunch of bright dots over here, which are called dark matter halos. These are very dense clumps of dark matter that that have condensed because of gravitational evolution, and there are also these filamentary structures that connect adjacent dark matter halos. And within these filaments, you'd be able to see tiny dots, which are also smaller halos. And within each of these halos, you would be able to find a galaxy sitting in them. So what you're seeing here is the large-scale structure of the universe simulated in a computer. So like I said, 5% of the universe is made of matter that you can observe. So one should theoretically be able to run a census and basically figure out where each of all the components that make up this regular matter exist. So that's what people tried to do for a lot of time. And they found out that 20% of the matter that we observe exists in collapsed form. Now, collapsed means that these particles of matter have just condensed into a dense state, making up stars and therefore galaxies, and the matter just outside galaxies, which is called the circumgalactic medium. The stuff between stars, the interstellar medium, the ICM, well, that stuff is not terribly important, but basically 20% exists in condensed form. 25 to 30% of it exists as cold Lyman alpha forest. These are clouds of hydrogen gas mostly, and these are not fully condensed, but you can observe them by looking at distant light sources and by measuring how much of their light gets absorbed by these cold forests of gas. Another 25% of gas has been observed to exist in a hot gas phase. So again, I guess I should give you a sense of what cold and hot means in this context. So cold refers to any gas that is at the temperature of 10,000 Kelvin. Now that is really, really hot, really, but when you put it in the context of the universe, it's not all that hot. And hot gas is 100 times hotter than that usually, so like 10 million Kelvin. That's the kind of temperatures that we are talking about. And there are several techniques that you can use to observe this hot gas. You indirectly infer their presence through specific line absorptions, mainly highly ionized oxygen. So if you have oxygen ions with 6 electrons removed from them, they would show up in this hot gas as absorption features. And similarly, again, Lyman alpha, which is the same as the cold gas stuff, but this is in the hot phase. And the rest of the gas, the remaining 30% is missing. We don't really see the gas. And astronomers for a long time were scratching their heads trying to figure out how they can observe the remaining gas. And this was called the missing baryon problem. So where is the missing matter? One just needs to look at their simulations to get the answer, really. This is one such instance of a simulation from 2001, which predicted that this missing matter is just invisible because it is fully ionized and it's just very, very diffuse. Now, you might be wondering why matter being ionized becomes invisible. And to that, I would tell you to think about neon lights. So when you pass electricity through neon gas or any such gas, it glows in a specific color. That is because what is happening is electrons in those atoms are getting excited to a higher energy level, and when they come back down to a lower energy, they emit light of a certain frequency. Now, if this atom is fully ionized, that is, no electrons going around the nucleus, then you can't have these specific energy levels anymore. And therefore, it's hard for light to really interact with such matter. It still does interact because it's simply charged particles, but because of the extremely diffuse nature of this gas, it is hard to spot that interaction. So what astronomers do to detect it is they crunch some numbers, do some fancy statistics. Basically in 2017, two teams of researchers working independently on this problem came up with a novel solution, which involved looking at pairs of galaxies which were thought to be connected by these cosmic web filaments. And they took the image of the cosmic microwave background near these galaxies along these filaments, and they stacked hundreds of thousands of these filaments together until they were able to observe a very small distortion of the CMB, the cosmic microwave background spectrum, or the light that is coming from it. From this distortion, they were able to infer the presence of this missing matter, or the fully ionized gas. But this is all very well and good. We have statistical detection of this hot gas, but is there a more direct approach? And it turns out there is. This is where the FRBs come in. What are FRBs? An FRB is a fast radio burst. And as the name suggests, it is a transient event. Basically, it's a flash of light. This light is only visible in the radio spectrum. Basically, if you have a large radio dish or some sort of an antenna, you would be able to observe these flashes of light. And these flashes are very brief, and that's why they're fast. They're called fast. So they last only a few milliseconds at most. And they seem to be coming from all around the sky everywhere. And they're very, very frequent. Expected numbers as of now land in a few thousands per day. So the first FRB was discovered back in 2007 when Duncan Lorimer and his student David Narkovic were going through some archival data. So these guys were looking for pulsars. Pulsars are a special class of objects. These are very dense stars, basically remnants of stars after the nuclear fusion cycle that every star goes through. And these are extremely dense. So basically think of the entire mass of the sun condensed into the size of Manhattan Island, New York, and you get an idea of how dense these objects are. And these are extremely fast rotating objects. and they're emitting light from what is called their magnetic axis, and they're rotating on a different axis called the rotational axis. So what you would see is like a a police siren or a lighthouse effect. You have these two beams coming out from the neutron stars, and when they face you, you see a blip of light. And these neutron stars are going so fast that they complete one rotation every second or so. So you see them going blip, 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 blip at regular intervals every day, all throughout. They never stop. They just keep on going forever. So these are neutron stars, and that's what they were looking for. But instead, they found this interesting class of object called FRBs, and they originally called it fast Fourier burst, but for a long time, well, even now, people call them Larimer burst after the discoverer. What you see on the right here is a plot of the emission that was recorded from this source in the archival data. So on the x-axis, you see time of arrival of this pulse. So a pulsar has got a periodically repeating pulses, right? This one, fast Fourier burst, has a single pulse coming from it. And that's what you see over here. And so on the y-axis, you can see the frequency of the light that was coming towards us. 1.5, so this frequency in gigahertz. This is kind of similar to the 5G antenna frequencies that will be used in the future. So you have gigahertz frequencies. And basically what you can see is that the higher frequency light is coming to Earth first, followed by a lower frequency light. And there's a very characteristic shape to the arrival time of this pulse. Ignore the inset for now. I'll talk about that later. So this is an isolated burst, and back when it was discovered, it was thought that this must be coming from outside our galaxy because of a specific property. Basically, if you look at how spread out this arrival time of the two frequencies are, so between 1.5 gigahertz and 1.2 gigahertz, you would notice that this is pretty large. And that is usually inferred to mean that it's coming from really far away. And if this is extragalactic, that means if it's coming from outside our galaxy, then it must be really bright for us to even observe such an event. So for a long time, people didn't know what these are. So how are they produced? If you ask any clickbaity media website or even History Channel, I guess, you would probably get the answer that is probably aliens. And for the hopeful out there, sure, keep in mind that this is always a possibility, and it's hard to rule this out completely. But it's very likely that it's not the case, simply because it's coming from so many different parts of the sky, and it's a very similar phenomenon. It's so much more likely that it is a naturally occurring event, not something produced by sentient civilizations. Just recently, last 2 months in April, towards the end of April, we were able to observe, or by we, I mean the people in Canada were able to observe a similar event like an FRB coming from a galactic source. So they observed this burst coming from a magnetar. A magnetar is a pulsar, the object that I described previously, but it has a magnetic field that is about 10,000 to 1,000,000 times stronger than a regular pulsar. So these are very extreme objects, and it's expected to have very weird physics going on its surface and nearby. And what we observed from it was emission that looked very much like an FRB, but it was much fainter than what an FRB would have been. So chances are all of these FRBs are mostly bursts from magnetars, but that still needs to be verified. So, okay. So before we go on, I need to go back to the slide just a little bit. So I told you that the higher frequencies arrive much earlier than the lower frequencies. Just keep this in mind. And the distance, the time delay between these two frequencies is something important. It gives you an idea of a specific property of the universe along the FRB line of sight. Right, so to understand how FRBs can help us shine light on this missing matter, we need to understand what a dispersion measure of an FRB is. Before that, we need to understand what dispersion is. I'm sure everyone here would have seen this logo at some point in their life. Of course, it's a very famous band. But what is more interesting to me right here is the physics that it describes. So what you see on the left is a beam of white light, and it's passing through a prism. And as it exits it, you have a separation of the individual frequencies of light coming out. This process, this physical phenomenon, is called dispersion. And it basically happens because light travels, different wavelengths or different frequencies of light travel at different speeds in transparent media. This is basically what happens to the light coming from an FRB as well. As the FRB light travels through this ionized gas, it also gets dispersed. The amount of dispersion depends on how much matter this light is passing through. This is kind of intuitive if you think about it. If you have a large prism, then you would expect the light to get dispersed much more than if you were to have a very tiny prism, right? And this amount of dispersion is quantified by a number called the dispersion measure, or DM for short. And it basically tells you how much charged matter is between you and the FRB source. So I'm going to play this video, which will try to describe what I'm trying to say here in a graphical format. So what you see here is a FRB host galaxy, and that's the FRB event. So the burst happened, and you see this individual frequencies of light traveling towards us at the speed of light, basically. So as they pass through a bunch of matter, you can see that the redder light starts lagging behind the bluer ones. And through more and more matter, this lag just goes on increasing. And yeah, that is the difference, the lag between the bluer and the redder parts of the spectrum is what you would quantify with the dispersion measure. So it finally reaches Earth, and it's picked up by this array of telescopes, radio dishes in Australia called ASCAP. And it goes through the signal processing algorithms, and we are able to find out or measure the dispersion of this light that has traveled billions of light years just to reach us. So we are able to get a glimpse of all the matter that it has passed through this. Right. So what this tells you is that FRBs basically are capable of shedding light on matter that is even invisible, because all that you need to measure is the dispersion measure itself. So that will tell you how much matter it has gone through. Over the years, over the last decade, the FRB field has gone through a lot of advancement, both technologically and in terms of the scientific knowledge that we have gained about FRBs. Back in 2012, we were able to, well, we as in humanity was able to localize the first FRB. That is, we were able to pinpoint the precise location of where this FRB was coming from, and it was localized to a galaxy that was a considerable distance away. So it, once and for all, it confirmed that these objects were indeed coming from outside our galaxy. Further into the future, 5 years again down the line, after 2012, ASCAP telescope was finally able to pinpoint, well, in 2018, it was able to pinpoint the location of the first FRB, which was not repeating. Oh, before that, I should probably mention that there are distinct populations of FRBs, some which repeat multiple times, some which don't. And the one that was discovered in 2012 was able to be localized just because it was repeating frequently. But in 2018, for the first time, we were able to localize a non-repeating FRB, and this was called FRB 180924. And since then, ASCAP has been continuously observing and localizing FRBs from different parts of the sky. One such FRB is FRB 2019-0608A, or FRB 190608 in short. So the naming convention is quite intuitive. The first four numbers represent the year of discovery, this next to the month, and the last two the date. And the letter tells you the order in which this discovery was made. So A stands for the first FRB detected on that date. If there was another one, that would be called B, and so on. So FRB 190608 was localized to a spiral arm of this very magnificent galaxies, which was at a relatively close distance, cosmologically speaking. And this host galaxy was special in the sense that we already had data about it in existing optical repositories, mainly the SDSS database, which stands for Sloan Digital Sky Survey. It is an optical survey that spans a certain amount of the sky in the northern hemisphere and some parts of the south also. And it collects information in the form of brightness of all the galaxies and stars in that field, and also the spectroscopic information for many of these galaxies. So we were quite lucky that an FRB landed smack dab on one of the spiral arms of this FRB, of this galaxy. So since this database contains extensive information about the galaxy and what the matter present in front of it, we were able to do some pretty interesting analysis. Namely, we were able to tell how much of the dispersion measure comes from each individual component or reservoir of matter between us and the FRB. So dispersion measure is basically what it means is that dispersion measure from the net dispersion measure of an FRB is the sum of individual dispersion measures from the host galaxy, the galaxies in between us, and the Milky Way itself. So from the SDSS database, we were able to tell how far these foreground galaxies are from the FRB sight line, that is, how far this transverse distance is, and also how far away these galaxies are from the FRB itself in this longitudinal direction. So with this information, additionally, we were also able to estimate the masses of each of these individual galaxies. So that gave us an idea of how much gas could be around each halo, or what is called the galactic halo of these galaxies. So with this information, we were able to determine what fraction of the dispersion measure was coming from each component. So we found out through analysis led by Jay Chittity that 33% of the dispersion measure was coming from the host galaxy and its galactic halo, or the gas inside its galactic halo. Similarly, based on some previous work done using pulsars in our own galaxy, we were able to determine that roughly another 33% of the dispersion measure is coming from the Milky Way. So this means we have already accounted for 2/3 of the matter that has been spotted by the FRB dispersion. In our work, we were able to determine that, or estimate that, basically 5 to 8% of the dispersion measure comes from the gas that resides in the galactic halos of the foreground galaxies in SDSS. So if you do the math, if you add all of these numbers up, you would immediately notice that this is nowhere close to 100%. There's still 25 to 35% of matter that needs to be accounted for. And this is where we invoke the fact that, you know, most of this gas must be in the cosmic web filaments, and therefore it has been invisible to us in the SDSS data. So how do we go about visualizing this gas? And that's where genius of two of my collaborators comes in, Joe Burchett and Oscar Elek. They came up with this very interesting approach that was inspired by the slime mold. Now, a slime mold is a collection of cells. I wouldn't call it a multicellular organism per se. It's more like a colony of cells. And it has very interesting feeding behavior. What it does is that it sends out tendrils probing for food particles on whatever surface it's on. And once it finds the food particle, it immediately draws in other tendrils and makes a beeline for that food particle. So you see over here in this animation, towards the forward end, you'd see the slime mold sending out its tendrils, and towards the backside, you'd see the veins becoming thinner. Basically, it means all the cells are now moving towards the food. So once it finds food, it does the same process again, like it repeats it. It then tries to find other particles of food, and by the end of it all, it would have created this sort of optimal network connecting all the food particles in its vicinity. So it doesn't really waste time looking in areas that it has already explored, and it has been shown that the network that it creates between the food particle is optimal in some sense. So Oscar and Joe, what they did was they tried to apply this in an attempt to estimate the cosmic web density between galaxies. So if you recall from the simulations that I showed, there were a bunch of galactic halos or dark matter halos embedded in a filamentary structure. So if you can trace out the filament between galaxies, or if you're given the positions of the galaxies, then you should be able to trace out the filamentary structure. And that's what they did. They ran a simulation where the galaxies were basically defined as food particles, and they ran a bunch of virtual Physarum particles in there. And once the simulation converged, so the simulation is a little more complex than just pushing a button. You have to first describe what a particle does and how it moves and all of that. I would encourage you to look at their work that has been published in the Astrophysical Journal. But basically, the gist of it is they were able to create a model of the cosmic web using data from the SDSS, using positions of galaxies from the SDSS. And that's what you see in these purple filaments. So the food particles or galaxies are shown here in yellow, and in the purple filaments, you can see the cosmic web structure. So that's what we did for this particular sight line. And we were able to map out the cosmic web starting from the FRB location on the right down to our location on the left. So the red line basically represents the FRB sight line, and the blue and green stuff is the cosmic web that has been estimated using data from SDSS and the NCPM model, Monte Carlo Phi-Saran machine. So finally, we can bring it all together, and we can say that the cosmic web actually does account for 25 to 35% of the dispersion measure based on the densities that were backed out using those simulations. So finally, if you add all of these numbers up, you notice that it is capable of hitting 100%. If you add them a bit differently, of course, it can exceed 100%, but that just shows that there is some systematic or underlying uncertainty in the estimation of each of these individual contributions to the dispersion measure. So what have we done? We have been able to create a model of the matter density in the universe, even though it was invisible to us based on constraints from the dispersion measure of this one particular FRB. Of course, if you want to do it for the rest of the universe, you would require FRBs in multiple locations, but this is a proof of concept that such an analysis is possible, and that was very exciting to us. So FRBs, so from this analysis, we got the following implications, and basically FRBs can truly shed light on all invisible matter, and it's a direct method of detection of ionized gas in the universe. And such an analysis is possible for any FRB sightline, provided we have sufficient optical data in the foreground. Basically, we would need the brightness of all the galaxies in front of the FRB and also the spectroscopic properties for each and every galaxy. So if you have the position and the brightness information, then you can go about doing this analysis. One can turn this analysis of head over heels, and you could ask, okay, if you have a certain amount of dispersion measure, then what is the amount of gas that should be between us? And if you're able to account for some amount of that gas, you can then infer any additional gas that you might have missed out. And you can then update your models of the universe based on that. You can probably do some sort of a tomography based on the dispersion measure of the cosmic web with thousands of FRBs in the future that we will probably detect and localize maybe in the next decade or so, maybe a few decades, who knows how much time it will take. But yeah, and we can also do other interesting science with FRBs, basically measure the cosmological parameters that were measured using the cosmic microwave background, for instance, but using FRBs instead. And you can then have an independent constraint on the expansion and the evolution of the universe. So if there's one key takeaway that I would like all of you to take as I come to the end of this talk, it is that FRBs are extremely useful, and they can be used to infer the presence of ionized matter, even though it is completely invisible to other methods. So with this, I've come to the end of my presentation. Thank you all for your patience and for tuning in, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Sunil. Can you guys hear me?
Oh, could I just ask if this has been recorded, this lecture?
So this lecture is currently being recorded, and I'll be uploading it to YouTube. And I'll send out the link.
Okay.
So
that would be good. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's go to a little bit of Q&A. We'll do Q&A for about 10 minutes. I ask that people limit their questions to about 1 or 2 minutes at a time, so that way everybody can get some questions in. And then just kind of blurt it out if you've got a question. Or if you don't feel like talking, you can always write it in the chat, and Sunil will get to it.
Okay, so the first question is by Antonin Gutmann, which is, why does fully ionized gas cause dispersion? So it's a little bit tricky to answer. Basically, it depends on the properties, the electromagnetic interaction of charged particles and light. But a simple way of thinking about it is, if you have a bunch of charged particles, and if you have a wave of electromagnetic energy passing through it, then these charged particles will respond. They will oscillate along with the electromagnetic wave, right? As these charged particles oscillate, they produce their own radiation, and this is what shows up as a variation in speed. So this oscillation will sometimes have a lag with respect to the original wave that was incoming. And because of this lag, the light that comes out of this system would have undergone some sort of dispersion. This lag, of course, depends on the individual wavelengths, and therefore there will be a difference in the arrival times of any light passing through charged gas. I hope that answered your question. I'm not sure if it was very clear. Okay, he says thanks.
I guess you couldn't draw a little diagram showing what you just said in it, and make a little picture of it, of the lag in radiation. It's kind of hard to.
Let me try. Yeah, let me try doing that.
Okay.
Let's see if I can do this. Okay, can you see the drawing that I'm making right now?
Yeah.
In red? Okay, great. So let's say you have some charged particles. Let's say most of these are electrons that I'm depicting in these minus signs that are very poorly drawn. And let's say you have some light coming in from the left side. So you have electromagnetic waves. So these are basically oscillations of electric field or and the magnetic field, right? And what I'm trying to show here is the crest of this oscillation. As it hits these charged particles, these begin to oscillate along the direction of the electromagnetic field. And therefore, because charged particles produce radiation of their own, they tend to, this creates a secondary electromagnetic wave coming from each of these individual charged particles. Now, with respect to the source electromagnetic wave, this outgoing wave could have some lag because it takes some time for the electrons to respond to the forces that are being applied by the incoming wave, right? So what ends up happening is that inside this medium, the wavelength of light changes just a little bit because there's now lag. Instead of covering so much distance, it now only covers a little bit, right? And this shows up as a difference in, as a reduction in speed. Now, this reduction in speed, of course, depends on what the wavelength originally was. If it was a short wavelength, then electrons respond rather quickly. If it was a long wavelength, it responds a bit differently. So each of these wavelengths gets lagged by a different amount. And that's why you have, towards the end of it, as light exits this charged mass, you would have a dispersion. Basically, redder light arrives later than the bluer light.
Yeah,
Okay.
do you think you could set up a laboratory experiment doing that? Because you could create some ionized particles, fully ionized particles in the laboratory, and you could create some radio waves in the laboratory. And so maybe you could show it in a laboratory experiment.
I'm not sure of the exact details, but it is possible to like just produce this experiment using even optical light. I mean, the same sort of phenomenon happens even in a piece of glass. That's why you have dispersion happening in a prism. So I'm sure if you pass radio waves through some sort of material like paraffin, it will undergo dispersion because of the electrons oscillating at different phases inside that material. So yeah,
Well,
you should be able to produce.
Well, yeah, but that's not fully ionized. You should set up an experiment with something that's fully ionized.
I mean, theoretically, it should be possible, but I don't really have the idea right now of the exact details of the experiment.
Okay, well,
but yes, it should be possible.
That would be interesting.
Right. Yeah.
So I've got a question for you.
Sure.
Is there like a simple model to explain the web-like patterns? I'm not initiated in astrophysics at all.
Right.
Intuitively, I would feel like all this matter should condense into points rather than remain connected with like diffuse matter. Of course, there's all these, like pushing forces that you've referred to as well. But this web-like pattern is very striking to me. So is there a simple way that you can explain that?
Let's see if I can. So basically, the web-like pattern is a dynamic picture. So it is not fully in equilibrium yet. So if you were to have a smooth distribution of particles, say, and you were to seed some of these points with overdensity, so you say, oh, I'm going to put an excess amount of matter in random locations. What would happen is basically particles would start streaming in towards these overdensities. And as part of the streaming process, you would basically expect filamentary structures, right? And that's basically what's happening in the universe. It has not fully evolved yet. So structure formation is a continuously occurring process. And these filaments are regions where matter is still flowing towards one of these clumps, the final stages, the halos at the center that between a filament, like at the ends of each filament.
So we could expect this web pattern to evolve over time, and it would look completely different, a billion years in the future.
Yeah, that's certainly true. According to our simulations, if you were to look at how the web pattern looks like in the past, it doesn't look all that much like a web, really. It's very fuzzy, and it looks, I don't know, it kind of looks like, well, what is something really fuzzy? Well, it looks like gelatin at some point, right? And as it evolves, the filaments start becoming more and more defined. And at some stage, billions and trillions of years into the future, you would not expect to see any of these filaments, and we would only see halos towards the end.
Wow, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Do we have any further questions? Alrighty. If you have further questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I will refer those to Sunil. Otherwise, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wonderful work with us. I've got a lot to think about later.
Well,
my place in the universe.
Yeah, I'm glad to really present it, and thank you so much for the opportunity again.
Yeah, of course. So we do put these talks on every month. They're hosted by the Women in Science and Engineering chapter at UC Santa Cruz. So the last Wednesday of every month, we'll be doing these Zoom seminars. Next month, we have a new professor at UC Santa Cruz. So her name is Raquel Chamorro Garcia. She'll be talking about her research on environmental toxins that change the metabolism of organisms that have been exposed to them, and how they process energy and gain weight. So that's going to be a very interesting talk that we should all look forward to tuning in for. And I'll be sending out the flyer for that shortly. So thank you again, everybody, for coming, and we'll see you next month. And I will be posting this video online and sending out the YouTube link.
Cool.
Thanks, everybody.
See you all.
Thank you,
Good
thank
night.
you, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay.
Thank you, Sunil. That was awesome.
No problem. Thanks for attending.